Captain Marcus Reed had fought alongside enough alien species during his 8 years in human special forces to understand that each brought unique advantages to joint military operations, but the Synaxi warriors assigned to the Kepler-6 campaign represented capabilities that challenged every assumption he'd developed about the relationship between biology and combat effectiveness. Their biomechanical armor seemed to function as external organ systems rather than protective equipment, creating warriors whose battlefield performance transcended normal limits of reflexes, endurance, and tactical awareness. "Captain Reed," came a voice from behind him as he reviewed tactical displays in the forward command post. "I am Commander Kira Velthane of Synaxi Strike Team Zephyr. I understand you have been assigned as human liaison for our joint operations." Marcus turned to find himself facing a figure whose presence immediately commanded attention through sheer physical authority rather than intimidating size. Kira stood perhaps 6 feet tall, but her biomechanical armor created the impression of someone designed for lethal efficiency: sleek composite materials that seemed to pulse with internal energy, articulated joints that suggested impossible range of motion, and sensor arrays that indicated awareness extending far beyond normal human sensory capabilities. Most remarkably, her chest plate featured a crystalline formation that glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns, shifting through colors and intensities that seemed to correlate with her attention and emotional state. The crystal appeared to be integrated directly into both her armor and her biology, creating a display that was simultaneously beautiful and somehow alien in ways that reminded Marcus of the fundamental differences between human and Synaxi physiology. "Commander," Marcus replied, offering the standard military greeting while noting that her helmet configuration allowed him to see features that were humanoid but distinctly alien: pointed ears, skin with a subtle silver tint, and eyes that held depth suggesting enhanced perceptual capabilities. "I've reviewed your strike team's operational records. Your tactical performance during the Arcturus campaign was remarkable. Adequate for mission requirements," Kira replied with the kind of professional modesty that suggested someone whose standards for combat effectiveness exceeded normal military expectations. "Your human strategic planning methods are less familiar to me. How do you recommend we coordinate approaches that accommodate both Synaxi enhanced capabilities and human technological advantages?" Marcus activated the holographic tactical display that showed Kepler-6's primary mining facility. Their joint target for the operation that would determine whether separatist forces could continue using the planet's rare mineral deposits to fund insurgent activities throughout the sector. Synaxi warriors excel at direct assault and close combat situations where enhanced reflexes and sensory capabilities provide decisive advantages, he said, highlighting approaches that would utilize their strengths. Human forces are most effective providing technological support, long-range coordination, and strategic flexibility that adapts to changing battlefield conditions. As they discussed operational planning, Marcus found himself paying attention to the way Kira's chest crystal shifted through different patterns: brighter pulses when she focused on complex tactical problems, steady glow when she reached strategic conclusions, and subtle color changes that seemed to indicate emotional responses that her controlled verbal communication didn't reveal. "Commander," Marcus said, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I'm curious about the function of the crystal integrated into your armor system. Is it primarily technological, biological, or some combination of both?" Kira's crystal flickered through patterns that Marcus couldn't interpret, though her slight pause suggested the question touched on sensitive topics. Synaxi biomechanical integration involves complex interactions between organic consciousness and technological enhancement that create capabilities not possible through purely mechanical or biological systems alone. Enhanced capabilities that come with personal costs. Enhanced capabilities that require adaptation to realities that normal civilian existence cannot accommodate, Kira replied with diplomatic precision that avoided specifics while confirming that her modifications involved sacrifices beyond simple military service obligations. Over the following days, as they planned and executed preliminary operations that would establish tactical advantages for the primary assault, Marcus observed how Kira's relationship with her strike team differed from typical human military dynamics. The Synaxi warriors functioned with almost telepathic coordination, their movements perfectly synchronized in ways that suggested shared consciousness or enhanced communication methods that operated below the threshold of normal perception. But Marcus also noticed that Kira's command style involved elements of isolation that seemed to separate her from her own troops as much as from the human forces they were supporting. During briefings, her tactical directions were clear and comprehensive, but her personal interactions remained formal in ways that suggested professional distance rather than the casual camaraderie that typically developed among warriors who fought together regularly. "Marcus," said Lieutenant Sarah Chen during one of their evening planning sessions, "have you noticed that Commander Kira seems to maintain careful distance from everyone, including her own people?" "I've noticed that Synaxi military culture emphasizes formal protocols over personal relationships," Marcus replied, though he'd been wondering about the same observation. "But you're right that she seems more isolated than her tactical role would require. Maybe enhanced capabilities come with social costs that we don't understand," Sarah suggested. "Integration with technology that creates superior warriors might also create barriers to normal personal connection." That evening, Marcus found Kira in the observation area of their forward base, studying terrain maps with the kind of focused concentration that made her chest crystal pulse with steady, rhythmic light. The bioluminescent patterns were hypnotic in the dim lighting, creating a display that was both beautiful and somehow melancholy. "Commander," Marcus said, approaching with the careful respect he'd learned to show when interrupting her solitary planning sessions, "do you mind if I ask you something about Synaxi approaches to military service and personal relationships?" "Ask," she replied, though her crystal's patterns shifted in ways that suggested wariness about personal topics. Human soldiers typically develop close bonds with unit members that help them process the psychological stresses of combat and military life. "Do Synaxi warriors experience similar needs for personal connection, or do your enhanced capabilities eliminate the social requirements that humans consider essential for psychological health?" Kira was quiet for several minutes, her crystals cycling through patterns that became increasingly complex as she considered his question. When she finally responded, her voice carried something that sounded like carefully controlled longing. "Synaxi modifications create capabilities that ordinary social interaction cannot accommodate," she said. "Enhanced awareness, accelerated processing, and integration with technology that operates beyond normal biological parameters. These advantages are incompatible with the kind of personal connections that unmodified beings develop naturally. Incompatible, or just difficult to maintain given the differences in perception and processing speed. Incompatible because the modifications that create superior warriors also create isolation from the experiences that normal beings use to develop emotional bonds and personal relationships," Kira replied. "We become effective at military coordination, but we lose access to the social connections that make such effectiveness meaningful beyond mission success." Marcus studied her profile and the way her crystal seemed to dim as she spoke about isolation, recognizing something in her controlled demeanor that reminded him of human soldiers who had learned to suppress personal needs that military culture couldn't accommodate. "That sounds like a significant sacrifice to make for enhanced combat capabilities," he observed. "It is the sacrifice that duty requires," Kira said, though her crystal's pattern suggested emotional complexity that her words didn't express. "And it is the reality that we must accept if we choose to serve in ways that protect those who cannot protect themselves. Even when that reality includes loneliness that enhanced capabilities can't eliminate." Kira turned to look at him directly, her alien features and enhanced sensory arrays creating an impression of someone evaluating him with capabilities that extended far beyond normal perception. "Captain Reed, why do you ask questions about personal costs rather than focusing on tactical coordination that will determine mission success?" "Because," Marcus said, recognizing that honesty might be more valuable than diplomatic evasion, "I've been watching you work with remarkable competence while maintaining distance that seems like protection rather than preference. And because I'm curious about the person whose enhanced capabilities haven't eliminated the kind of thoughtful intelligence that makes strategic planning sessions feel more like collaborative problem-solving than simple military briefings." Kira's crystal brightened noticeably, cycling through patterns that suggested surprise mixed with something that might have been interest, though Marcus couldn't interpret the specific emotional content of the display. "You observe carefully for someone whose role is tactical coordination rather than psychological analysis," she said. "I observe carefully because I'm working with someone whose capabilities I respect and whose isolation I find concerning from a personal perspective as well as a professional one. As they returned to their respective quarters for the evening, Marcus reflected on how his assignment as liaison to Synaxi forces had evolved beyond simple military cooperation into curiosity about the person whose enhanced abilities seemed to have created exactly the kind of loneliness that her warrior training had taught her to endure rather than address. 3 weeks into the Kepler-6 campaign, Marcus had learned to read the subtle patterns in Kira's chest crystal well enough to anticipate her tactical decisions and emotional responses, though he was beginning to suspect that his growing ability to interpret her biomechanical displays reflected more than just professional observation skills. Their joint operations had proven remarkably effective, with his strategic planning abilities complementing her enhanced combat capabilities in ways that created tactical advantages neither human nor Synaxi forces could achieve independently. The Separatist positions are more heavily fortified than intelligence reports indicated, Kira said during their morning briefing, her crystal pulsing with patterns that Marcus had learned indicated complex problem-solving analysis. Standard assault approaches will result in unacceptable casualties among both our forces. Agreed, Marcus replied, studying the reconnaissance data that showed defensive installations designed to counter conventional military doctrine. But their fortifications assume attacks from forces limited by normal biological capabilities. Your enhanced reflexes and sensory awareness might allow infiltration approaches that standard tactics wouldn't consider. You're suggesting that Synaxi modifications provide advantages that can circumvent defensive systems designed for normal combat parameters. I'm suggesting that your abilities might allow us to identify vulnerabilities that human tactical analysis would miss, Marcus said, noting how her crystal brightened when he acknowledged her enhanced capabilities rather than simply planning around them. What do you detect about their defensive arrangements that my sensors can't register? Kira moved to the tactical display, her armored fingers manipulating holographic controls with fluid precision while her crystals cycled through patterns that indicated deep concentration. Electromagnetic signatures suggest power distribution that creates temporary vulnerabilities during shift changes, acoustic dampening that could conceal approach vectors from specific angles, and personnel rotation patterns that indicate fatigue among key defensive positions. Information that your armor's sensor integration provides automatically. Information that Synaxi modifications make it possible to process and correlate in ways that individual human analysis cannot match, Kira confirmed. But advantages that come with limitations that human strategic thinking might help us overcome. What kind of limitations? Enhanced awareness creates detailed tactical information, but strategic decision-making requires broader perspective that our modifications sometimes make difficult to maintain, she explained. We see individual elements clearly, but human approach to pattern recognition might provide context that helps us understand how those elements fit together. As they developed assault plans that combined her enhanced perceptual abilities with his strategic analysis, Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by Kira's intelligence and the way their different cognitive approaches created solutions that neither could have developed independently. But he also noticed that their collaboration required her to function in ways that seemed to push against her military conditioning. Kira, Marcus said during a brief break between planning sessions, can I ask you something about Synaxi modification procedures and their effects on personal identity? Ask, she replied, though her crystal's patterns suggested wariness about personal topics. Your tactical abilities are remarkable, but I've noticed that collaborative planning seems to engage aspects of your thinking that pure military doctrine doesn't typically require. Do the modifications that create enhanced combat capabilities also affect how you process non-military information and relationships? Kira was quiet for a moment, her crystal cycling through complex patterns that seemed to indicate internal processing that extended beyond simple consideration of his question. Synaxi modifications enhance military-relevant capabilities while reducing emphasis on psychological and social functions that are considered non-essential for combat effectiveness, she said carefully. The result is warriors who excel at tactical operations but who may struggle with personal interactions that require emotional processing or relationship development. Struggle how? Enhanced awareness creates constant input about other beings' emotional states, physiological responses, and behavioral patterns, but modification protocols teach us to process that information tactically rather than personally, Kira explained. We understand what others are feeling and thinking, but we're conditioned to use that understanding for strategic advantage rather than emotional connection. Marcus processed this information while studying the way her crystal seemed to dim when she discussed emotional limitations, recognizing that her modifications had created capabilities that came at the cost of normal social functioning. That sounds like it would make personal relationships extremely difficult to develop or maintain, he observed. Personal relationships become complications that military effectiveness requires us to minimize, Kira said. Enhanced warriors are trained to prioritize mission success over individual emotional needs, whether our own or those of others we might encounter. Even when those emotional needs might actually enhance rather than compromise mission effectiveness. How do you mean? Marcus considered his words carefully, recognizing that he was approaching territory that might affect their professional relationship as well as touching on personal topics that her conditioning made her reluctant to explore. I mean that our collaborative planning has been more effective than either of us could achieve independently, he said. Your enhanced capabilities provide information that human analysis would miss, while my strategic thinking helps you process that information in ways that create broader tactical understanding. We work well together because we complement each other's strengths rather than competing with them. And you think this collaborative effectiveness might extend to personal relationship development as well as tactical coordination? I think that isolation might be making you less effective than you could be with appropriate social connection, Marcus replied. And I think that your modifications might create needs for specific types of personal interaction rather than eliminating the need for connection entirely. Kira's crystal brightened significantly, cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate surprise mixed with something that might have been hope, though she maintained the controlled demeanor that characterized her professional interactions. Marcus, she said, using his given name for the first time during their collaboration, what makes you think that someone whose modifications have separated them from normal social functioning could develop meaningful personal relationships with unmodified beings? Because, Marcus said, recognizing that honesty was more valuable than diplomatic caution, I've been watching you work with remarkable competence while maintaining isolation that seems like learned behavior rather than personal preference. And because the collaborative effectiveness we've developed suggests that your enhanced capabilities might actually benefit from rather than be compromised by appropriate social connection. Appropriate social connection with someone who understands that enhanced awareness creates needs and responses that normal relationship patterns cannot accommodate. Appropriate social connection with someone who appreciates your capabilities while recognizing that enhanced abilities don't eliminate the fundamental needs for understanding, respect, and companionship that affect all sentient beings, Marcus replied. Their conversation was interrupted by combat alerts that required immediate tactical response, but as they coordinated assault operations that utilized both her enhanced capabilities and his strategic planning, Marcus noticed that Kira's crystal displays had acquired new patterns, brighter, more complex, and somehow more expressive than the controlled patterns he'd observed during their previous combat operations. Marcus, Kira said during the post-operation briefing, your suggestions about collaborative effectiveness and personal connection, they merit further consideration when our military duties allow for extended discussion. I'd welcome that discussion, Marcus replied, realizing that his assignment as liaison to Synaxi forces had evolved into something that might challenge assumptions about the compatibility between enhanced military capabilities and personal emotional needs that both their cultures considered mutually exclusive. Looking at Kira's crystal as it pulsed with patterns that seemed both more vibrant and somehow more vulnerable than her usual controlled displays, Marcus began to wonder whether the isolation that her modifications had created might be protection rather than limitation, and whether the right kind of personal connection might help her discover capabilities that even her enhanced systems hadn't yet realized were possible. The assault on Kepler-6's primary mining facility began at 0300 hours with coordinated strikes that demonstrated exactly why human strategic planning and Synaxi enhanced capabilities had proven so effective in combination. Marcus coordinated overall tactical flow from the command post while Kira led her strike team through defensive positions that should have been impregnable against conventional assault approaches. Zephyr team is through the outer perimeter, came Kira's voice over the communication link, her words accompanied by the sound of weapons fire and explosions that indicated intense close combat. Enhanced sensory integration is detecting defensive patterns that confirm your strategic analysis. They're adapting to standard assault doctrine but not accounting for capabilities that exceed normal biological limitations. Copy that, Zephyr Leader, Marcus replied, monitoring tactical displays that showed Kira's team moving through the facility with the kind of coordinated precision that seemed almost supernatural. Be advised that structural analysis indicates potential weak points in sections 7 through 12 that might provide alternate routes to primary objectives. As the battle progressed, Marcus found himself increasingly amazed by the extent of Kira's enhanced abilities. Through sensor feeds and tactical communications, he observed her team function with coordination that transcended normal military training, their movements perfectly synchronized, their tactical awareness extending to threats that conventional sensors couldn't detect, and their combat effectiveness reaching levels that suggested true fusion between biological intuition and technological enhancement. But he also noticed that maintaining such performance clearly required enormous effort that Kira attempted to conceal from both her own troops and the human forces providing support. Her communication patterns became more clipped as the operation continued, her tactical decisions showed signs of the kind of fatigue that resulted from processing information at rates that exceeded normal cognitive capacity, and the sensor readings from her biomechanical systems indicated stress levels that would have disabled unmodified beings. Zephyr Leader, Marcus said during a brief lull in combat operations, status report on team condition and capability for continued operations. Team operational within acceptable parameters, Kira replied, though her crystal's patterns, visible through her armor's external sensors, showed irregularities that suggested system stress or physiological exhaustion. Proceeding to primary objective as planned. Kira, Marcus said, using her name instead of rank to indicate personal rather than purely tactical concern, your biomechanical readings are showing stress indicators that suggest you need to consider tactical alternatives that don't require maximum enhancement levels. Enhancement levels are necessary for mission success, she replied with the kind of professional determination that Marcus recognized as someone pushing through limitations that could become dangerous if ignored. Objective requirements exceed capabilities that normal operational parameters could provide. The final phase of the assault required Kira's team to penetrate the facility's core where separatist forces had established their command center and primary defensive positions. Marcus watched through tactical displays as her enhanced capabilities allowed approaches that no human force could have attempted. Movements through spaces too confined for normal combat armor, reflexes that responded to threats before human perception could register them, and tactical coordination that seemed to anticipate enemy responses before they occurred. When the battle finally concluded with complete tactical success and securing of all primary objectives, Marcus felt relief that was both professional and deeply personal. But his satisfaction at mission accomplishment was tempered by concern for Kira, whose biomechanical readings continued to show irregularities that suggested the effort required for such performance had pushed her enhanced systems beyond their normal operational limits. All teams, primary objectives secured, came the final tactical report. Separatist command structure eliminated, mining facilities under Allied control, strategic objectives achieved with minimal casualties. Marcus made his way through the captured facility to the forward command post where Kira was conducting post-operation debriefings with her strike team. Her usual composed demeanor remained intact, but he could see that her chest crystal was displaying patterns unlike anything he'd observed during their weeks of collaboration, irregular pulses, color variations that seemed unstable, and intensity fluctuations that suggested either equipment malfunction or physiological distress. "Commander," Marcus said as her team dispersed to secure their equipment and prepare for extraction, "I need to discuss some concerns about your biomechanical readings during the final assault phase." "Readings are within acceptable variance for extended enhancement operations," Kira replied, though her crystal's patterns contradicted her verbal assessment of system status. "Kira, acceptable variance for what?" "Because the stress indicators I'm seeing suggest that maintaining those enhancement levels for much longer could have resulted in system failure or physical damage that would compromise your ability to function effectively. Enhanced capabilities require adaptation to operational demands that exceed normal biological limitations," she said, her controlled voice betraying nothing while her crystal continued its irregular display patterns. "Cost-benefit analysis indicates that mission success justifies temporary stress to biomechanical integration systems." Marcus studied her carefully, noting that despite her professional composure, something in her posture suggested the kind of exhaustion that went beyond normal combat fatigue. temporary stress that you're still experiencing right now, 2 hours after the operation concluded? System recovery requires time proportional to enhancement levels utilized during tactical operations, Kira replied, though her explanation carried the quality of someone reciting protocols rather than describing personal experience. And during system recovery, what kind of support or medical attention do enhanced warriors typically receive? Enhanced warriors are trained to process recovery independently without requiring external assistance that might compromise operational security or reveal technical specifications of modification procedures, she said, her crystal's irregular patterns suggesting that independence might be imposed rather than preferred. Marcus realized that Kira's isolation wasn't just social conditioning but practical necessity. Her enhanced capabilities came with recovery requirements that normal medical protocols couldn't address, while her warrior training emphasized self-sufficiency that prevented her from seeking help even when experiencing distress that her systems couldn't manage independently. Kira, he said, moving closer with the kind of careful approach that he'd learned to use when addressing topics that her conditioning made her reluctant to discuss, what happens if system recovery doesn't proceed normally? Do you have backup protocols or support resources that can help if your biomechanical integration experiences problems that independent processing can't resolve? Enhanced warriors are designed to be self-sufficient for all operational requirements, she replied, though her crystal's continued irregularities suggested that current circumstances might be testing the limits of designed self-sufficiency. Designed to be self-sufficient, or trained to avoid seeking help that might reveal vulnerabilities that your military culture considers inappropriate for warriors to acknowledge. Kira's crystal flickered through patterns that seemed to indicate complex emotional processing, and for the first time since he'd known her, Marcus saw her composed facade crack slightly as she processed implications that her conditioning had taught her to ignore. Marcus, she said quietly, enhanced modifications create capabilities that normal medical understanding cannot address, and vulnerabilities that standard support systems cannot accommodate. Independence is not just training preference, it is practical necessity when your physiological requirements exceed what unmodified beings can provide or understand. But what if someone wanted to try understanding, even if their knowledge wasn't sufficient to provide complete assistance? Marcus asked. What if you didn't have to process everything independently because someone cared enough about your welfare to learn whatever they could about how to help? Kira's crystal patterns shifted to displays that Marcus had never seen before, brighter but somehow fragile, complex but unstable, beautiful but suggesting something that might have been hope mixed with fear about possibilities that her training had taught her to consider impossible. You're asking whether I would trust someone to see me during system recovery when my enhanced capabilities are compromised and my normal psychological defenses are non-functional, she said, her voice carrying vulnerability that her warrior conditioning rarely allowed her to express. I'm asking whether you would trust me to stay with you while you recover from pushing your enhanced systems beyond their normal limits to ensure mission success, Marcus replied. And whether you would let me help in whatever ways someone without modifications could provide support to someone whose capabilities I respect and whose welfare has become important to me personally. As they stood in the quiet command post of the facility they had just captured through coordinated efforts that neither could have achieved independently, Marcus realized that their collaboration was approaching a decision point that would determine whether their partnership could extend beyond tactical cooperation into the kind of personal connection that both their cultures assumed was impossible between enhanced and unmodified beings. 6 hours after the successful assault, Marcus found Kira in a quiet section of the captured facility where the biomechanical stress indicators from her armor had become impossible to ignore. Her crystal was displaying patterns he'd never seen before, irregular pulses that seemed to indicate system instability, color variations that shifted unpredictably, and intensity fluctuations that suggested her enhanced capabilities were struggling with recovery processes that normal rest couldn't address. Kira, Marcus said, approaching with the careful concern that had developed during their weeks of collaboration, your crystal's patterns look different than anything I've observed during our previous operations. Are you experiencing complications that require medical attention? Biomechanical integration is processing enhanced operation stress according to standard recovery protocols, she replied, though her voice carried strain that her controlled demeanor couldn't completely conceal. System stabilization requires time and should not concern unmodified personnel. Marcus studied her posture and the way she was holding herself, Small signs of discomfort that someone without his growing familiarity with her behavioral patterns might have missed. Standard recovery protocols that include irregular crystal displays, obvious physical discomfort, and isolation from any support systems that might help with whatever you're experiencing. Enhanced warriors process recovery independently to maintain operational security and avoid revealing system vulnerabilities that could compromise future tactical effectiveness, Kira said, reciting doctrine that clearly prioritized military concerns over personal welfare. But we're not in a tactical situation anymore, Marcus pointed out. The mission is complete, extraction is scheduled for tomorrow, and you're alone in a section of the facility trying to manage what looks like significant physiological stress without any assistance. Kira's crystal flickered through particularly unstable patterns as she processed his observation, and Marcus realized that her enhanced systems were creating distress that her warrior training had never equipped her to handle in isolation. Marcus, she said quietly, enhanced integration creates recovery requirements that normal medical procedures cannot address. Biomechanical systems must recalibrate autonomously, and that process involves vulnerabilities that are not appropriate for others to observe. Vulnerabilities like what? Like temporary reduction in enhanced capabilities, psychological state fluctuations that compromise normal emotional control, and physical responses to system stress that create dependencies that warriors are trained to manage independently, she explained, her crystal's irregular patterns seeming to emphasize each point. Marcus moved closer, recognizing that her isolation was imposed by training rather than chosen by preference. Kira, what if someone wanted to help not as a medical provider or tactical support, but simply as someone who cares about your welfare and wants to ensure you don't have to process this stress completely alone? You don't understand the nature of biomechanical integration or the complications that system recovery can create for unmodified consciousness, she replied, though her crystal's pattern suggested hope mixed with fear about possibilities her conditioning had taught her to avoid. Then help me understand, Marcus said, settling beside her with the kind of patient attention that had made their tactical collaboration so effective. Show me what recovery involves, and let me decide whether I'm capable of providing whatever support might be helpful. Kira was very still for several minutes, her crystal cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate complex internal processing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of careful decision-making that suggested someone choosing trust despite realistic concerns about potential consequences. Enhanced integration creates direct neural connections between organic consciousness and technological systems, she said. During standard operations, these connections allow enhanced capabilities while maintaining psychological barriers that protect individual identity. But recovery from extreme enhancement requires reducing those barriers in ways that can create temporary psychic accessibility. Psychic accessibility. Biomechanical systems sometimes establish neural connections with compatible consciousness patterns during stress recovery, creating temporary access to thoughts and emotions that normal privacy would protect, Kira explained. Contact with my armor's crystal formation during system recalibration could trigger such connections. Marcus processed this information while studying the way her crystal seemed to pulse with anticipation rather than warning. You're saying that if I touched your crystal right now, I might gain temporary access to your thoughts and feelings? I'm saying that biomechanical stress recovery sometimes creates psychic vulnerabilities that could expose aspects of enhanced consciousness that others are not prepared to experience, she replied. Thoughts, emotions, and enhanced sensory input that normal beings cannot process without psychological complications. And you're warning me about these vulnerabilities because you're concerned about my welfare, or because you're concerned about your privacy. Kira's crystal brightened significantly, cycling through patterns that suggested emotional complexity beyond anything Marcus had observed during their collaboration. I'm warning you because temporary psychic connection could reveal feelings and needs that my warrior conditioning has taught me to suppress, and because such knowledge might create complications for our professional relationship that neither of us anticipated when we began working together. Marcus reached out slowly, his hand hovering near the crystal formation in her chest plate while he met her eyes directly. Kira, what if I'm willing to risk complications because I care more about your welfare than about maintaining professional boundaries that might be preventing exactly the kind of connection that could help both of us? Marcus, you don't understand what you're offering to experience, Kira said, her crystal pulsing with patterns that seemed to convey both longing and fear. Enhanced consciousness processes reality differently than unmodified awareness. What you would encounter through psychic connection might be overwhelming or disturbing in ways that could affect your ability to interact with me normally afterward. Then let me make that choice, Marcus replied, his hand still hovering near her crystal. Let me decide whether I'm strong enough to handle whatever you're afraid I might discover. Kira studied his expression with the kind of enhanced perception that allowed her to read emotional states and physiological responses beyond normal human capability. Whatever she detected in his vital signs and psychological patterns seemed to satisfy her assessment of his readiness for what he was proposing. If you're certain, she said quietly, place your hand directly on the crystal formation and maintain contact regardless of whatever sensory input you receive. The connection will establish gradually, but once formed, interrupting it prematurely could cause feedback that damages both our consciousness patterns. Marcus pressed his palm against the warm surface of her crystal, feeling immediately the subtle vibration that indicated active biomechanical systems. For a moment, nothing seemed to change beyond the physical sensation of contact with technology that pulsed with internal energy. Then the connection ignited. The flood of sensation that poured through Marcus was unlike anything human consciousness was designed to process, enhanced sensory input that revealed details about their environment that his normal perception had missed completely, tactical awareness that extended to threats and opportunities beyond his natural detection range, and emotional responses that carried the intensity of feelings amplified through technological enhancement. But beneath the overwhelming sensory data, Marcus encountered Kira's actual thoughts and emotions, unfiltered by the professional composure that her warrior training required her to maintain. He experienced her constant awareness of isolation created by modifications that separated her from normal social connection, her deep loneliness that enhancement protocols had taught her to endure rather than address, and her carefully suppressed feelings for him that she developed despite conditioning that prioritized mission effectiveness over personal attachments. Marcus came her voice directly into his consciousness, though her lips hadn't moved, you're experiencing what enhanced awareness processes constantly, input that normal consciousness cannot handle without technological assistance. But you're also accessing emotional states that I've been hiding even from myself, Through their connection, Marcus felt the full weight of her attraction to him, not just physical appreciation, but emotional need for connection with someone who saw her as more than just enhanced military capabilities. He experienced her fear that her modifications had made normal relationships impossible, her hope that someone might value her despite the technological changes that defined her existence, and her desperate desire for companionship that transcended tactical cooperation. I can feel everything you've been carrying alone, Marcus responded through their mental link, and it's not overwhelming, it's heartbreaking. You've been isolated not because you don't need connection, but because you were told that enhanced capabilities eliminated your right to seek it, The modifications create needs that normal relationships cannot fulfill, Kira's thoughts carried the weight of years of conditioning. Enhanced consciousness requires understanding that unmodified beings cannot provide. Maybe enhanced consciousness requires understanding from someone willing to learn rather than someone who already possesses identical capabilities, Marcus suggested, his thoughts flowing directly to her without the barriers that verbal communication normally created. Maybe the isolation you've accepted isn't necessary, maybe it's just the result of assumptions about compatibility that neither of our cultures bothered to test. Through their psychic connection, Marcus experienced Kira's surprise at discovering that her enhanced emotional responses didn't overwhelm his unmodified consciousness, while she encountered his genuine attraction to both her capabilities and the vulnerable person they protected. The contact revealed that their tactical collaboration had been built on mutual respect and growing affection that both had been afraid to acknowledge due to assumptions about the impossibility of meaningful relationships between enhanced and unmodified beings. You're not disturbed by accessing enhanced consciousness patterns, Kira asked, her mental voice carrying amazement. I'm amazed by experiencing the complexity of what you process constantly, Marcus replied. And I'm honored that you trusted me with access to thoughts and feelings that you've been protecting from everyone else. Marcus, her thoughts carried emotional intensity that her voice had never been allowed to express, Through this connection I can sense that your feelings for me aren't based on curiosity about enhanced capabilities or attraction to exotic military technology. They're based on appreciation for your intelligence, respect for your strength, and affection for the person whose isolation I want to help end. Marcus confirmed through their mental link. Your enhanced capabilities are impressive, but they're not the foundation for feelings that developed while watching you balance tactical brilliance with genuine concern for others. As their psychic connection deepened, both experienced the revelation that their partnership could transcend the limitations that military protocols and species assumptions had created around enhanced unmodified relationships. Marcus discovered that supporting enhanced consciousness didn't require identical capabilities, it required understanding, acceptance, and emotional commitment that could bridge technological differences. Kira learned that her modifications hadn't eliminated her capacity for meaningful connection, they had simply changed the requirements for finding someone compatible with her enhanced reality. When the biomechanical stress finally resolved and their psychic connection gradually faded, Marcus and Kira found themselves looking at each other with the knowledge that their relationship had permanently moved beyond professional collaboration into something that challenged every assumption both their cultures held about the compatibility between enhanced and normal consciousness. "How do you feel?" Kira asked, her crystal now displaying steady, peaceful patterns that suggested complete system recovery. "Like I finally understand who you really are beneath the warrior training and enhanced capabilities," Marcus replied. "And like I want to build something with you that accommodates both your enhanced reality and my unmodified one. Even knowing that my modifications create needs and responses that normal relationship patterns cannot predict or accommodate. Especially knowing that," Marcus said, taking her hand with the same careful reverence he'd shown when touching her crystal. "Because what I experienced through our connection convinced me that enhanced capabilities don't eliminate the need for love, they just change what love needs to provide." 6 months later, Marcus and Kira had been assigned as permanent partners for operations requiring human-Synaxi cooperation, their tactical effectiveness having proven that enhanced and unmodified consciousness could create capabilities that neither could achieve independently. But more importantly, their personal relationship had become a model for connections that transcended the technological and cultural barriers both species had assumed made such partnerships impossible. "Any regrets about touching the crystal that first time?" Kira asked during one of their evening conversations, her biomechanical displays now showing patterns that Marcus had learned to read as contentment mixed with affection. "My only regret," Marcus replied, "is that it took a crisis situation for you to trust me with the psychic connection that showed us both how compatible we really are. Though I suppose some discoveries require exactly the right circumstances to become possible. And my only regret," Kira said, her crystal brightening with the warmth that characterized her displays when she felt completely understood, "is that I spent so many years believing that enhanced consciousness eliminated my capacity for love instead of just changing what love needed to look like." Their relationship had indeed proven that the most meaningful connections could develop between beings whose consciousness operated according to completely different parameters, and that understanding someone required not identical capabilities but genuine commitment to learning whatever was necessary to provide the support and companionship that made isolation unnecessary for anyone willing to trust another with their deepest vulnerabilities.